Hello, London's calling. I'm Sean Dukes, CEO of Learn Smarter Apps, and I'm here today to talk to you about Process Builder. Indeed, I'm talking to you about one process in Process Builder. Why, you might ask? Well, as an ISV, we get to see and have fun installing our app into loads and loads of different Salesforce orgs, hundreds over the years that we've worked in and worked with. And one thing we see again and again is multiple processes running on the same object. And quite often we see processes that just run every single time a record is updated with no criteria at all. And I'm just sitting there going, why? Now, I'm sure the audience here is much better educated than obviously most of the world, but I can tell you there's some people working in some pretty big Salesforce orgs who perhaps don't know everything about Salesforce best practices. So that's what I want to explore. I want to look at what Salesforce best practices are, look at what the recommendations are, and possibly give you a few tips about how processes can be optimized and how you can do what Salesforce recommends, which is essentially run one process per object. Let's go and look into that. But first of all, let's have a think about what exactly Process Builder is. So as you probably know, Process Builder is a declarative tool that allows you to essentially do stuff. So for example, when a record is updated in Salesforce, you can make further updates, you can create subsidiary records, you could send a chatter post, that kind of stuff. But what Process Builder is really doing is it's executing code. And that's important to understand because you need to, if you're going to use Process Builder properly, you need to understand that you are actually running code and possibly think a little bit like a coder. So that's one of the things I definitely want to talk about. But before we go into all of that, let's have a look at what Salesforce say the best practice should be. So here we are. Best practices for designing processes. You may know, I'm sure, that there's a help file article on this. So let's go and have a look at it, shall we? A couple of things in here that come out. So the first one is, it says for each object use one automation tool. And the second thing is have only one record change process per object. Think about the first one of those. It says here in each object have one process or basically don't have one process, one apex trigger and three workflow rules. So Salesforce even recommend that you don't have apex triggers running in addition to processes. Now, if that is what you want to do, and there are plenty of use cases where that possibly isn't a very good idea, but if that is what you want to do, then what you need to do is essentially create, instead of creating apex triggers, you would create an invocable method, and then you could call that from within your flow. There's situations when that's not really going to work. For example, delete would be a good case when you really need to have an apex trigger if you want something to happen when you delete records. But anyway, that's Salesforce's recommendation. Only use one tool and have only one record process, change process per object. So why do people have lots of them? Let's have a look and see if we can understand a bit about that. So for many people learning Salesforce, your go-to resource is Trailhead. So here is a Trailhead trail. We'll look at it. Automate simple business processes with Process Builder. And the first thing it tells you to do if you start doing this trail is to create a process called closed won opportunities. Why? That's crazy. I mean, that is definitely not best practice because then you're going to have one called closed won opportunities, one called closed lost opportunities, one called not really quite sure where we are opportunities, or whatever. So this trail, as far as I'm reading it, is really encouraging you not to follow best practice, which is a shame. The other thing we want to understand, and we'll talk about this a bit further in terms of a good trail I recommend, I'm going to give you one at the end, but the other thing to understand is really a little bit about how and when these processes are running. So there's this thing called the order of execution, and it's important to understand a little bit about it. So we don't go too far into it. You would do a lot more if you perhaps were going to do your Dev 1 exam or something. But if we look in here, there's a couple of things in this article that are useful to know. So the first one is that when it talks about executing workflow rules, processes come under that umbrella. So processes are executed here. And what is important to understand is that when Salesforce runs updates, it runs them inside something called a transaction. And the way a transaction works essentially is all the updates kind of happen and then your records all get committed to the database in one go at the end. You can see down here at the bottom, it talks about committing all the operations to the database. So if your process is running somewhere in the middle of this, right, it could be just updating that one record, but it might be triggering creating other records or creating updates in other records, especially if you're using a flow or whatever. You could be updating multiple records across the database. And so it's important to understand then that you're going to be concerned with things like governor limits, for example, because you could have your process, essentially, if you hit a governor limit because you're trying to update too many records at one go, what will happen is that your process will fail and your save will fail as well. You won't be able to save that record. Instead, your users will get a nice error message, which isn't really a great user experience. So it's important to understand that there's a lot of implications to firing off a process. It may not be quite as simple as it looks. And then the other thing, and I'm just going to move myself out of the way here, I'm just interested in this really, but it does say in this order of execution that your roll-up summaries are going to get calculated as a part of that order of execution. And I think strictly that isn't quite true. Certainly in our experience, roll-up summaries get calculated afterwards, but they are quite interesting. And I'll show you an article that explains that. If you come down here and you find this article about the roll-up summary fields, you'll see that it says that it can take up to 30 minutes to calculate a value of a roll-up summary field. So that suggests it isn't happening as part of that initial transaction. And that's certainly what I think, right? So it's not happening, it's happening asynchronously and it's happening later. And that in itself is interesting because when roll-up summaries happen, what they do is they update that field within the database, and that field does change. So that will be, the record will change, and that will fire Process Builder all over again. Now that can be a good thing and a bad thing. If you're expecting it and you think that might happen, then you might want to do something when a record, a roll-up summary is updated. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're not expecting it and it does happen, you might get weird things happening that you don't understand why on earth they're happening. It could be simply because a roll-up summary is updating. So it could be in another object, something's happening and weird things are going on or whatever. Now, you may have heard, it's a new thing in the in Spring 20, before save update flows. What is all that about? So this is actually a new technology that Salesforce is promoting now. It's reckoned to be 10 times faster than Process Builder, and that's all to do with that order of execution and when these things happen, and they basically happen at a much earlier stage before anything has been, any records have been created and stuff like that. So they're faster. Now I suspect that in the course of time, these before save update flows are probably going to become much more important than Process Builder. However, when I submitted my talk to London's Calling, no one even heard of these things. So there we are. We're going with Process Builder now. But it certainly is something that is interesting to explore. So if you are interested, I'd recommend reading up about them and trying to work out how to run before save update flows, because essentially they are faster and more efficient. But then you'd have to kind of think, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with all my processes? Because do I really want to replace all of my existing processes with one of these things? I think if I was in a new org, I might have a very different view on that. But it's definitely something that's worth looking at and worth thinking about. Anyway, Process Builder, that's what we're talking about today. So let's just go over the basics of Process Builder. I'm sure for most of you this is really, really familiar. Sorry, go a bit too quickly. So obviously you start your process, and the first thing you do when you start your process is you choose an object, okay? And then you're going to make some kind of decision. So you have a sort of decision box here, and typically you're going to have a criteria test. So you're going to ask a question, and it's either going to be true, in which case something's going to happen, or it's not, and then the process stops, or it's not going to be true, in which case you go on to the next thing and you perform you ask the next question, or maybe you don't. Now I'm going to encourage you to, but some people certainly don't. And then that does whatever it does or whatever, and then you go on to the next one and so on and so on. So the question is then, and this is something I think that people aren't always aware of, it's certainly not that obvious, and it took me a while to work it out. One thing is that this stop thing here isn't necessarily a stop, because you can change it to an evaluate next criteria step. And if you do that, then what happens is that essentially if that criteria is met, this action can be performed, and then actually it runs down and goes to the next decision. So you can actually, this is how, or this is the first tool in the toolbox really, to run multiple steps on with one process on one object. So if you don't know that, then that's going to be really, really useful. So without that, you can't really do it. Because the other thing about Process Builder, when we're thinking about code, is that the reason why Salesforce recommend, or one of the reasons why they recommend that you have one process per object, is that you can control the order in which things happen. So you've got thing 1 happening, thing 2 happening, thing 3 happening, whatever, and there is an order to it. So you can only control that order if you put all your processes, all your steps into one process. If you have multiple processes, then they're going to happen in any kind of random order. You have no control over that. And also, to be honest, you can't really, they're still going to happen in the same transaction. So you're not kind of gaining anything, really you're just losing. They're all still happening in the same transaction. So anyway, I want to talk about this criteria here now, because this is important. So strongly recommend that you put some criteria in. When you go to build the criteria, you get a screen like this, and you can choose to meet some conditions or evaluate a formula. And to be honest, use both. I actually quite like, I tend to prefer using formulas. I'm not quite sure if one is better than the other, but they both achieve a very, very similar thing. So you have a number of conditions. You can have some custom logic and stuff like that. You can have some conditions, and then essentially if that test is passed, then your process is going to go off and do whatever that thing is. Now, when we're looking at this, or the other thing you can do is you can just select this, no criteria, just execute the actions. And when I see that, I'm just going, just no, don't. I can't think of a single use case where that is a good idea. Every single time a record is updated for whatever reason, you just update, just execute the actions. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. But I do see it quite often in customer orgs. Anyway, assuming you're not going to do that, when you do put your criteria in, you'll see at the bottom there's a step called advanced. And this asks you an interesting question. I was going to move myself out of the way here. So the question it says is, do you want to execute the actions only when specified changes are made to the record? It's not very obvious. In fact, it took me a long time to work out what on earth they were talking about. But when you actually look at what that, if you click on the I button, you'll see this message. Essentially, what this does is it, let's say you've got a field and you're checking for a value of this field. If you check this box, then this step will only be executed when, not only when that criteria is met, but when that field has changed to meet that criteria. And that's really, really important. So definitely I'd recommend that almost always, there's very few use cases when I wouldn't want to check that box and essentially apply that criteria and only execute it if something had actually changed. Okay. Now, we're going to go and look at Process Builder in a minute, and when we do that, we're also going to talk about some other things. So we'll briefly cover nested processes, where you can have one process firing within another. We'll talk a little bit about flows, and we're going to talk about scheduled actions as well. So here we go. Right, so time to get hands-on. Right, so here's my org, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the setup here. So I'm in setup here, and I come into the menu and I type process. And you can see there we've got Process Builder down there at the bottom. You can see I've got some existing processes running on the opportunity object. Obviously, I'm going to work with the processes I already have, but just for the case of example, I'm going to show you then creating a new process, and we'll do what it says in Trailhead and create a new one, all about close run opportunities. And this process starts when a record changes. You can also have a process, as I said earlier, we talk about processes being invoked by another process. Now that can be quite useful in a couple of ways. So you can create a sub-process that doesn't fire automatically, but can be called by a step in a process. And that can be useful in a couple of ways. One is if, like with code, for example, you can create code that's reusable. You can create processes that are reusable. So you could reuse that same code, perhaps in multiple different steps within your process builder. It's also useful if you want to, within your sub-process, have a series of additional checks and decisions and so on and so on and so on. So it can be quite useful like that. So sub-process definitely useful, but we're going to do the process that starts when a record changes. and then we're going to click save. And then the next thing you need to do is add an object. So we're going to add our object, which obviously is going to be opportunity. And then you get asked this question, which I do not understand. You can either start the process only when a record is created or when a record is created or edited. And there you've got technical debt right there. Why is that? I don't know. I can't tell you. So we're going to go for when a record is created or edited because you can cope with things like a record being new very, very simply. So I'm going to save that. Because if you wanted to run something that's new, so when you come to this new step, you could just do this formula evaluates to true and just type is new, right? And so you could, if you want something to happen only when a record is new, you can use a simple formula like that and then fire along with your process, okay? And I'm a bit bored with this process. I want to look at my better one in a second, so I'm finishing with this now, so I'm just going to cancel that. But that's some of the basic steps of the process, and one of the reasons I think why people go wrong straight out of the box. Okay, let's go back and view all processes. And so another thing it took me a long time to discover was how to get rid of processes I no longer wanted. I didn't realize if you click this little drop down here, there is a delete on the right hand side. And if I click that delete, off it goes. If you've got lots of versions of your process, at the moment I've only got one, you have to delete every single version. You have to wait while the screen refreshes and go in and do the next one. And it is a bit of a pain, but you can do it. So if you want to get rid of your opportunities, you can. So here we've got a sub process and then an opportunity process. Let's go into our opportunity process and look at this. So here's my process that I've got, and you can see I've got a number of different steps in it. The first thing that you've got to have a number of processes to do this, but you can switch around the order of things, and that's really, really simple to do, like so. And then the next thing I'm going to show you is this thing here, which I'm very, very keen on, and that's a switch. So the first thing I always do, and would recommend you do in processes, in triggers, in validation rules, in duplicate rules, and possibly, obviously, in auto launch flows as well, would be to include a switch so that you can switch that process off. Why that's useful is, especially for us as an ISV, our app is going to run test code. If your validation rule or your process or whatever causes something to happen that our test code is not expecting, then it's very likely that our test code will fail. And it's super useful to be able to turn off every single thing in the org with a switch. In this case, I've just got a field on the user, but you could use a custom setting for this as well. And so that's the first thing. I want to put a switch in there. And then what I want to do is actually I don't want to do anything at all, which is quite difficult to do. So there is not an option within a process builder to not do anything. If you leave that blank, you can't actually activate your process. You must have an action in there. And so the one we use is we create a flow, and I'm just going to show you that flow very simply. We have a flow that doesn't do anything. So you have to do something, but what we're going to do is essentially run a flow that doesn't do anything. And this is how it is. So here's my do nothing flow. So let's just kind of have a quick look at that in the flow builder. And you can see here, it's very simple. I've got a start, and then I've got an assignment step. Let's have a look at that assignment step. So what I do is I create a new variable, which is called empty variable. It's a text variable, and I make it equal to a global constant that's already within there called empty string. So essentially I make nothing equal to nothing, and then it's done. And that's what my flow does. And then when I run that, nothing happens. So if I want to go into my switch everything off, run through there and stop, that's perfect for me, okay? The next thing then is we're going to come down to this first one here. So is the opportunity one, and is it more than £10,000? Yes, it is. Now I've got a formula here. I could equally use the condition builder, but I like formulas, so there's my formula. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to check this advanced boxes. At the moment I haven't, so I would strongly recommend you go in here to this advanced box and check yes, because that means it's only going to run when this changes to meet this criteria, rather than running when every single time that the record is updated, if this criteria happens to be true. So you don't want to send a chatter post out every single time you update a record saying the same thing. You only want to send it out when that record happens. And so that's why you check this yes box, right? And then when you save that, two things happen that are interesting. One is you get this scheduled action box coming up, which I also want to talk about. So first thing is we're just going to do, in this case, a very, very simple. We're going to create a chatter post. And then what you can also do is you can create scheduled actions. So Scheduled actions are quite cool, but I don't want to do that just yet because what I actually want to do is I want to, once this has happened, I want to go down and run the next thing. So instead of clicking stop here, if you click on there, you can evaluate the next criteria. And if I save that, essentially the scheduled action goes away and it will go down. So in my process, I haven't got my switch off, so that's fine. If my opportunity is one and more than 10,000 and it's changed to that, I send out my chatter post, and then I'm going to come down and create or evaluate the next criteria. So this is just a silly thing where I'm just changing the value of a pick list. But essentially, if it's a certain color, I want to change it to a different color. So again, in this case, I am going to, for two reasons I'm going to do this. One is because it's a really good idea. And the second thing, it gives me the opportunity to create a timed action. Again, you cannot save your flow, your process, without having something in the immediate actions here. So I need to have something in there, but actually what I'm doing in this case is just calling my same flow, which doesn't do anything. And then I want my scheduled action to run. So this is what I'm going to do. So if you run this essentially 0 hours after the last modified date, this will run essentially as soon as that record has been saved. So it will run immediately after that, and that can be really, really useful. Obviously, you can run it later, you can run it days later, but this can be really, really useful. And why it's useful is if you've got rather like a roll-up summary, because that's quite a complex transaction, it doesn't happen when the initial record is saved, so that save is quicker, and you don't run into query limits. You can use that kind of idea yourself. So if you set something as a scheduled action, it will run after the initial save has completed. And it could be a minute or a couple of minutes later or whatever. So essentially what I'm going to do then is I'm going to run, I'm going to add an action to that. So essentially on my process, if I change the color to amber, it doesn't like that, and it's going to change it to gold. So I'm going to update a record, and I'm going to update the change to gold, and I'm going to update the record that I started with, and choose that, and then I'm going to find a field. So in this case, because I've already applied my criteria, then no criteria update the records is just fine, but you could apply more criteria here at this point. So I've got a field called mood color, and I'm going to change it to gold. So if the user put miserable and they put in amber, I'm going to change it to gold. But it's just a silly thing, but just to give you an idea of how you can run these scheduled actions. And then I'm going to activate that. So there we are. So they are the basic steps of the process, right? Now let's go and have an opportunity. So let's go to opportunities. And I've got my opportunity here, and you can see there that the mood color is gold. If I change this, right, so I'm going to change it to something else. I'm going to change it to red, essentially, and save it. And to be honest, because this is happening asynchronously, it's not necessarily going to happen. You'd have to watch me while I do several refreshes just to prove to myself it hasn't happened. But essentially, let's just do one. Nothing's happened. That's still going to be saying red, or it better be. When it loads up again, okay, so it's still going to say red. If I change that to amber, which I want to do, and then save it, then it's going to save as amber. If I refresh it, it might still be amber because it does take a few seconds to run. So it is amber, but in a few seconds it will change to gold. So I'm going to refresh that again. And there it goes to gold. So there's an example of an asynchronous process running. So essentially my processes run through, and I would tend to put those probably at the end. With those asynchronous processes or any timed action, it will only run if the criteria is still met. So the criteria has to be met for that thing to run, even though you've set it to run later. That criteria still has to be met. So there we are. There's some hints on the process builder. Right, now let's go back to the PowerPoint. Here we go. Right, so we did the hands-on. That was good fun. So really just to sum up then, a few recommendations from what we've been looking at there. So the first one is that I recommend you understand your org. You need to understand that if your process is updating other records in other objects, it could cause you to hit query limits and stuff like that. Also be aware things like roll-up summaries could cause your process to fire when you're not expecting it. So try and just understand, get a map of your org, understand what's going on, what flows you've got, what processes you've got, what Apex triggers are doing, all that kind of stuff is really, really useful, and that will definitely be really helpful. Think like a coder. So don't run things every single time without bothering to check whether that record has changed. Always check to see whether the record has changed before you update something. And the last one, and this is just a plea as an ISV, please, please, please put a switch in, because it makes our life so much easier. Now, I did say I'd recommend another Trailhead module. So this one, it's not the most obvious because it talks about workflow migration, but it's actually a very, very good Trailhead trail to teach you about the best practices of putting multiple actions into a single process. So if you do one Trailhead trail, do this one. And that's it. I'm done. I will be around to answer questions, but thank you very, very much. I hope you have a wonderful day. What a shame. What a shame that we couldn't all get together in London. But I still hope this is going to be a fantastic event, and thank you very much. I'm Sean. Bye for now.
Hi, I'm Peter Coffey, Vice President for Strategic Research at Salesforce. I'm here live on the expo floor at Dreamforce, still the world's largest single company technology event. The word capado, it means you've got this, and I think that's what people want from DevOps. They want a high level of assurance so that they can go do what they do, which is understand their customers and bring them an experience they've never had before. I'm Peter Coffey with Salesforce, encouraging you to build on capado.